Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We would like to welcome you to this press briefing on a case of Professor Anming Hu under the China Initiative. I very much appreciate all of you joining us on relatively short notice on this important case and the implications on the so-called China Initiative, and also more generally with respect to the environment for Chinese scientists and academics. As I said, my name is John Yang. My organization, Advancing Justice AAJC, is an organization whose mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and promote a fair and equitable society for all. We're very thankful to have with us as co-partners on this series of webinars and on this project to focus on the racial profiling of Asian American and specifically Chinese American scientists and academics to partner with the Brennan Center for Justice, Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs, or APAPA, United Chinese Americans, or UCA, and the APA Justice Task Force. And we appreciate the hard work of all of these organizations in giving everyone very useful and important information about what is happening in this context. I know that we have several reporters that are joining us today, and thank you very much for joining us and covering these issues. Please feel free to use the Q&A box and identify yourself, what publication or media that you are with, and ask your question. At that time, when we get to the Q&A section at the end, what we'll do is unmute your mic and open your video so that you can ask your question directly if you are interested. Certainly, if you want, we can certainly ask your question for you. As many of you know, on this past Wednesday, on June 16th, the trial against Professor Hu resulted in a mistrial after the jury deadlocked and failed to reach a verdict. It is clear that a number of jurors recognize a number of issues with respect to this case and the evidence that was presented before them, including evidence that there was falsified evidence about Dr. Hu, about sort of who he was and what he did. And there were many other concerns presented about what this case means with respect to the academic community. One of the things we also wanted to focus on is how this case is rooted in racial bias and profiling under the Trump era notion of the China Initiative. So here to speak today are our esteemed speakers, including the defense attorney for Professor Hu, who will provide a briefing of the trial. We also have representatives from the community, from the civil rights community and the local community on how we can support Professor Hu, so what this case has meant to these communities and the damaging impact of the China Initiative on these various communities. So our speakers today, and the order in which they will speak, is Frank Wu, Professor Frank Wu, who will present an overview of the China Initiative. Phil Lamonaco, who is the defense attorney for Jing Lai, who is the president of the Tennessee Chinese American Alliance, and Michael German, who was a fellow for Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. As I said, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of this briefing, and I encourage everyone to ask questions at that time. Like I said, Professor Hu's case is just simply one case of many unjust cases that we've seen under the Trump Initiative. And we've seen a number of cases that have resulted in unjust prosecutions of Asian Americans and immigrant scientists being charged with federal crimes for what we would consider administrative mistakes on a university or administrative form, stemming from unclear direction from their universities, or even a reversal on what collaboration means, collaboration that was previously encouraged with international institutions. During this briefing today, we will discuss our concerns regarding Professor Hu's trial, including the mass profiling and targeting of our communities. Look, to be clear with respect to where many of our organizations are, we seek to end racial profiling and discriminatory prosecutions of Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, and seek justice for many impacted individuals, like Professor Hu and his family. So towards that end, number one, we would urge the U.S. attorney in this case to drop the case against Professor Hu, given the evidence that has been presented, so that he can freely return to his life and his family and really be reunited with all of them in a free and fair manner. Number two, we would want to address the root issues underlying Professor Hu's case, so why this case was brought and the context in which it was brought. As such, Advancing Justice AAJC spearheaded a letter along with a number of the organizations represented here, asking for an end to the China Initiative. Number three, we would ask the Biden administration for a moratorium on the China Initiative and to review all of these prosecutions and investigations under this DOJ initiative to determine whether these cases targeted individuals based on race, ethnicity, or ancestry. At a minimum, we would ask that faculty, staff, and scholars have the opportunity to adjust their previous forms and provide any additional disclosures without being prosecuted or facing negative employment consequences. Now, to get to our briefing, I will turn first to Professor Frank Hu, the president of Queens College at the City University of New York, to share his concerns and provide the context of the China Initiative and what this has done for our academic community. Professor Hu.
Thank you so much, everyone. So at the outset, I want to say we're on the American team here. That's what is so concerning. There's long been an image that if you're of Asian descent, you're a perpetual foreigner. And recently, with the terrible violence that we've witnessed, Asian Americans have finally been brought into the dialogue about civil rights. This is no different. The China Initiative, announced a couple of years ago, was a new initiative. That's what the Justice Department said. That's why they had a huge press conference to declare that they were going to do something they hadn't previously done. They were going to take laws that had just lain dormant on the books and begin to aggressively enforce them. That's not my theory. That's their theory. That's why they had this giant press conference 3 years ago in order to say to the world, we're going to do what we've never done before. Indeed, as my friend and colleague John Yang pointed out, universities until very recently were encouraging this type of collaboration and telling their faculty, go out and find us a partner in China, do everything you can. All of that changed. The China Initiative is premised explicitly on the theory that there is ethnic affinity and thus a propensity on the part of people of Chinese descent, even if they're United States citizens or Canadian citizens, to act in violation of American law for the benefit of Beijing. This means that even clerical errors, such as mistakes filling out forms, become criminally prosecuted in a manner that was never done before, similar to the prosecutions you would bring for organized crime against mobsters and murderers. Let us be clear, and I've put it into the chat so you can take a look for yourself. Senior officials of the federal government have expressly said, there's no interpretation, they've expressly said all Chinese students are spies, or almost all Chinese students are spies. They've identified specifically scientists and scholars as non-traditional collectors of intelligence data. And they've made no effort, despite organizations such as John's requesting this, they've made no effort to distinguish between foreign nationals on the one hand and bona fide United States citizens, naturalized and native born on the other hand. That means that ordinary behaviors trigger suspicion. Now, from time to time, some will deny that there's racial profiling. They'll say, no, this is just about behavior, except that ordinary behaviors, such as scientific cooperation or visiting your mother, the sorts of things that we would commend, suddenly become suspicious for some people when for other people we would shrug and it wouldn't mean anything at all. So the denial that ethnicity is not involved is hardly credible. If it's not explicit bias, it's at least implicit. I'll wrap up here so that John can continue. There's been a disproportionate impact on a minority community, a chilling effect on important research that leads to discoveries and progress for the world, and the serious potential of reverse brain drain. This does not help the American national interest. No doubt, there are real cases of espionage. These are not those cases. John, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. Next, we'll hear from Phil LaMonaco, who was the defense attorney or is the defense attorney for Dr. Hu. And he could provide some context for this particular case and how this has developed and the current status of the case. Phil.
Thank you, John. Yes, the China Initiative is clearly what started our criminal case. Professor Hu was two PhDs at the University of Tennessee working in nanoscience and doing well, exceeding expectations for his contribution to the University of Tennessee. As part of his work, he was encouraged to reach out to other scientists around the world for students from different universities in the United States and in China and other countries to collaborate and talk about their research and join together in publications, writing papers that were published in scientific journals, top scientific journals recognized around the world. This is what he was doing. He was getting better and better at it. He had an opportunity to go to many countries and speak as a professor, and his reputation was growing. And the University of Tennessee was encouraging to do that. Mr. Hu met and communicated with students in other parts of the world and brought them back to the University of Tennessee as visiting scholars, which benefited University of Tennessee, did research for them, and they were all very happy with it. And then the China Initiative came along, and just because of the kind of work that Anming, Professor Hu, did, made him low-hanging fruit when you're looking for something to go after, because his name is all over the internet on these publications. And when he collaborates with somebody in China or has a Chinese student working with him at the University of Tennessee, it's published. So we believe that the FBI got their marching orders from the China Initiative, and were told to go out, and the U.S. attorneys were told to go out and investigate, and the cases would be supported, and they would bring indictments. And our local FBI agent was no different. He started doing research on the internet, and one thing he focused on was the 1,000 Talents program, which is, there's several different talents programs in China. The 1,000 Talents program has in the past had some connection to the Chinese government. And the FBI agent came, and after reviewing a number of different documents and publications, he and an agent from the Department of Energy dropped in on Professor Hu unannounced one morning and asked him if he was a 1,000 Talents member. Now, I've obtained this FBI agent's initial memo starting the case, and several of the facts in the memo were not accurate. For one, Professor Hu was listed as a member of the 1,000 Talents program. That was not true. The information said it was from varying degrees of reliability. And so they came and talked to Professor Hu. He denied being a member of the 1,000 Talents. He also told them he had NASA grants he was working on, which didn't appear to affect the FBI agent at all. And this was in April of 2018. He told Professor Hu, do you have any places in China offering to pay for your seminar or offering to have you as a speaker? And he said yes, and he indicated that there was a China university that wanted him to come and talk. He told that to the FBI. The FBI told him, oh, okay, well, we want you to go there. We want you to go, we want you to come and talk to us first. And then we want you to go over there and attend the seminar. And then when you come back, we want you to come back and talk to us some more. And I don't know what that sounds like to most people, but to me, it sounds like they wanted him to go and spy on the university that was holding the seminar. And I accused the agent of that. I think, if I remember correctly, he denied that he was trying to recruit Professor Hu, but it was pretty obvious that he wanted him to do that kind of work. So Professor Hu, after some consideration, said, well, I'm really too busy. I'm not going to go to the seminar. Do you still want me to come and talk to you? And the agent basically did not respond, but started a 1 year and 9 month clandestine investigation surveillance of Professor Hu. The agent had no evidence that we can find or has been produced in the case that there was even a reasonable suspicion that Professor Hu was committing some sort of crime. No articulable facts at all to show that they should spend that kind of resource. They had 6 or 7 agents or operatives following him around to work, to school, to the grocery store, going through his trash. For 1 year and 9 months, they followed his son. We have pictures of his son, who was a freshman at the University of Tennessee. Of course, Professor Hu had no knowledge that they were doing this. And then, to make a long story short, they couldn't find anything, but they found a NASA restriction because somebody at the university or for whatever, they thought, well, okay, let's look at this. NASA said, well, is not supposed to give grant money to any or collaborate with China or Chinese corporation in any of their grants. They can't participate according to the NASA restriction, which is very vague. It doesn't exactly say who China is or a Chinese company is. It doesn't talk about what kind of participation or collaboration, but the FBI found this, and then they found a form that Professor Hu had been filling out since he started working there the same way, because he did not believe his part-time summer employment at Beijing University, which he had, was a conflict of interest because it did not rise to the definition of conflict of interest, according to UT's own manuals. So then the FBI had to go and have PowerPoint presentations with the administrators at UT, 3 of them, July, August, and September 2019. First one replete with inaccuracies and lies about, and they were all geared at schooling the administrators on Professor Hu's activity that was connected to the military, all kinds of things that weren't true. And basically, in my opinion, and I argued it to the jury, they weaponized these administrators so that every one of them that came into the trial to testified, oh, had we known that he had that part-time job in Beijing, we would not have allowed him to apply for the grant. So the FBI created a crime where one didn't exist, and they argued to the jury that he did not tell UT because then they couldn't get a grant if he had told UT. The money didn't go to Professor Hu. He got a little bit on one grant because he worked during the summer, but this was work that was performed for the university, and he didn't cause no harm to NASA at all. But the FBI argued that he committed fraud. He tricked, he had a scheme, a plot to trick NASA into believing that he was not violating the NASA restriction. And this is the first time the NASA restriction has been litigated. I don't believe they've got the definition correct because for one thing, they told Professor Hu, the administrator, that it didn't apply to him. But in order to make their argument work, they would have to argue that Professor Hu is China. In other words, NASA cannot collaborate with China or a Chinese corporation. So they have to argue that he's either China or a Chinese corporation. And nobody ever gave him any kind of instruction or training on what this thing meant. The closest instruction they had is, I mean, well, this doesn't apply to you, but we got to make this assurance to NASA. So, I mean, he's an innocent person that got his job taken away from him, his life ruined. And I'm just glad there's some people on the jury that didn't drink the Kool-Aid with the rest of them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil. And one of the things that Phil talked about that I think is important for people to hear again is that there have been senior officials, number one, who have said that every Chinese student that comes to the United States should be presumed to be a spy. Number two, we have had FBI Director Wray that have talked about this issue with respect to scientific research and Chinese scientists as an all of society problem. And number three, we have had senior officials in the prior administration say that every single US attorney's office should have a China initiative related case. So this goes to what Phil is suggesting, is that there are line attorneys, line FBI agents that almost feel that this is part of their job duties to find such a case, not to be searching, not to be just doing their regular duties, but to actually actively seek out. And in certain cases, whether it is through fabricated, exaggerated evidence or otherwise, create something that doesn't exist. So let me turn it now over to Mike German, who was a fellow at the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center, to share his insights as a former FBI agent on what this investigation, some of the facts that have been revealed to him about how this China initiative may be being conducted.
Thanks very much, John. And I'll keep my initial remarks short and be happy to take any questions. But obviously, the FBI has a long history of using racial, ethnic, and national origin bias as a proxy for national security threats. This is a problem that is persistent within the FBI and was a big part of my concern when the Trump Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, announced this China initiative, that I knew that it would drive some inappropriate elements in who gets targeted for investigations and who ultimately gets prosecuted. And I think this case is a perfect example of the problems with this type of approach that uses racial bias as a proxy for a national security threat. Whereas Frank said, ordinary conduct committed by any other university professor or scientist is seen as benign, but because there is what the FBI and the Justice Department have referred to as a nexus to China, which is merely ancestry, that creates suspicion in and of itself. And that inappropriate suspicion is then used to drive investigations that even when they fail to identify what is sought, i.e. economic espionage committed by agents of the People's Republic of China government, they continue on because they need to produce statistical accomplishments for the program. And this sort of pressure is what is extremely problematic about having a program called the China Initiative. And again, as Frank and John have said, nobody questions that the Chinese government is engaged in some bad behavior and engages in espionage and economic espionage. And those are things that the Justice Department and the FBI should be focused on. But this type of investigation and prosecution is a distraction from that serious effort, right? That this is not what they say they're investigating. And in fact, of course, there are other countries that engage in economic espionage. So diverting cases into fit statistical accomplishments for a specific program can cause more harm to our national security than it resolves. So I'm happy to take questions, and thanks for everybody for helping to organize this event.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike. So let me turn last but certainly not least to Jing Liangcai, who is the president of the Tennessee Chinese American Alliance and the chairman of United Chinese Americans, to share his work about how the local community has responded to Professor Hu's case and in raising awareness about the issue of racial profiling.
Thank you, John. Sorry, I got a video problem here. But certainly the FBI surveillance and accusations over the last few years has created a great deal of fear among really campuses around the country, in particular in University of Tennessee, University of Memphis, and all these campuses. And during the last few years, as we see more and more, and many of them, even including like when we're trying to go to the Knoxville to support Professor Hu, there was great deal of reluctance among many academics and researchers and professors, reluctant to show their face, okay, on the campuses, because they know they're being watched, surveyed, and there were kind of tremendous kind of fear created among them. However, I have to say, many of the Chinese community has stepped up, especially in Knoxville. Well, Professor Hu was house arrest, under house arrest. He's not allowed to leave the house. And basically everything that he needs has to be brought into the house. The Knoxville Chinese community support his daily living from that standpoint and provide the food and support for more than a year. It was really a great deal of, I'm sure, comfort to Professor Hu to endure this hardship and injustice and to survive until this day. And during the trial, we also have rallied Chinese community members around Tennessee, from Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville to Chattanooga. And there are more than 50 of them came a long way from their cities to the hearings and to support Professor Hu. And we also, made a press conference that voiced our protest to this racial profiling and really tremendous injustice inflicted to Professor Hu and his family and many other Chinese professors still under pending cases over the next few months. So I want to say, really, the only thing, last thing I want to say is that, this is certainly not alone. He's not the only one that's being prosecuted. There's many people's lives have been ruined around the country and created great deal of fear in the community. And we want this to come to stop. And this is really an injustice that against racial profiling. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So now we'll go to the question and answer period. I know we are starting to get some questions, but please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask questions or indicate that you want to ask a question. The first question that we will have is from Ellen Chen. There you are. Okay, excellent. And you have been unmuted, so please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, John. Thank you for hosting this event. And I would have a question for Mr. Lamonaco. Since the beginning of this trial, there are massive ton of media coverage regarding this case. And as you have mentioned that Professor Hu's name is kind of on the internet everywhere. It's kind of tied to China Initiative, and he got suspended after the trial started. So I was wondering, does Professor Hu plan to seek damage, and what does justice look like to you?
Well, that's a good question. We've discussed that many times. We're still trying to decide what avenue to take. All of the facts are not in yet as far as the final outcome, whether the government is going to indicate a dismissal or a retrial. And we also have Judge Varlin, who was an excellent judge during this. I don't think we could have had a better judge. He was very fair and level-headed. And we made motions to dismiss after the government's proof, which is typical. And typically after you make those motions, the judge denies it, and then you go on with the case. Well, we filed motions to dismiss based about 3 different theories, and the judge took them all in advisement. And then we renewed those at the end of the trial. And the judge indicated that if he needs further briefing, he'll let us know. And so we want to wait to see what the judge does with that. One of the main motions we filed was vagueness, that the NASA restriction was too vague to understand, and how can you form intent to violate it if you don't know what it means? But, we've looked at all the lost money that he suffered from his position. We don't know if he is going to be swept up by ICE at this point. If the government dismisses the case, then since he's here, now he he could not legally renew his visa because he couldn't go back to the border and go through border crossing, which they require. So if they drop the case, then, you know, the immigrations people might say, well, he's here illegally. But we think that the University of Tennessee should hold some responsibility for what happened. We don't know exactly what avenue we're going to take, but, you know, they terminated him without pay. And to me, they were not supporting him. In fact, some of the things they did really caused the crime to be committed. So we're looking at the University of Tennessee for some kind of responsibility and remuneration.
So the Justice
Yeah,
Department hasn't filed any motion or like going to dismiss this case or going to the next step. They haven't
Right.
indicated anything.
Not yet.
Right. And Phil, it might be useful because you talked about a motion to dismiss. It might be just useful to let everyone know what are the next steps or potential next steps, whether the government can take or the judge can take, because there's a few different avenues few different things that could happen next.
Right. Well, the government could take a step to indicate that they do not want to retry or that they're going to retry. Technically, there is no set time limit for them to make that announcement. The judge will probably wait a little while, and if the judge doesn't hear anything, he'll probably ask. Now, the judge at any time could rule on our motions to dismiss. I think the judge is waiting, so hoping that maybe that the government drops the case, then he doesn't have to rule. And, you know, courts try to be conservative in that way. Why go ahead and make a ruling if it's going to be dropped anyway? So that's what we're waiting for right now, for the government to make a decision. And I think the judge may wait a little bit longer to decide what to do.
Thanks, Phil. The next question is from Jeffrey Mervis from Science Magazine. Jeffrey, can you be unmuted? If not, I can ask a question.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent.
Thanks. This is for Phil. Could you explain a little more why the FBI agent thought that Dr. Hu had participated in a 1,000 Talents program, and did Dr. Hu at any point ever apply, or was he asked by Beijing Institute of Technology to apply to a foreign talents program?
Well, Professor Hu was in a short-term talents program. Many of the universities have talents programs. It's not unusual. Some of them are sponsored by the Chinese government himself, and some of them are sponsored by municipal communities.
And what was who was his sponsored by?
I'm sorry?
And who was his sponsored by?
He had a part-time job at the Beijing University of Technology. He started that back in about 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And it was very, very short-term on his summer vacations and during Christmas. And he never spent more than a month a year. So I don't want to misquote the statements here, but under the guidelines for the University of Tennessee, it did not qualify as a conflict of interest. So when they asked him on the conflict of interest form if he had employment, he put down no. He started doing that in 2014 and never applied for his NASA grant for 2 years after that. So, you know, how can he even anticipate that he's going to try to trick NASA 2 years before he even applies for a grant? So it was just something that the FBI latched onto and inflated it and made every bit of, get as much mileage out of that any way they could. But Professor Hu reported it in many other ways. He listed his affiliations, his collaborations, his students that came from Beijing University. Professor Hu reported those in his annual reports to the university. In fact, in the NASA restriction and the NASA grant, when he was making a proposal for the first NASA grant, he had a letter from a professor at the Beijing University saying, I've had a long time collaboration with Professor Hu, and I think we could help and collaborate on this, and can I get involved, basically. And Professor Hu took that letter and gave it to NASA, emailed it to NASA, and emailed it to the administrator at UT that was responsible for the grant application. Why would he be hiding? Why would he be hiding his affiliation if he comes with a guy saying, I've got a long-time collaboration with Professor Hu? Professor Hu was completely clueless that they were thinking he was China or a Chinese corporation.
Yeah.
And
Great. Okay, Jeffrey, did you have another follow-up question?
I
Sorry.
wanted to clarify, you said, so the UT conflict of interest rule didn't apply because it was summer, or because it was the duration, or?
the conflict of interest, you can see it in their handbook, and you can also see it in their policy, which says instructions, use this policy to fill out, no, on the conflict of interest form, it says use the policy PL 0125 for the definition of conflict of interest. And you go through it, and you have to have like $10,000 or more from an outside interest. And it all actually really all talks about is conflicts during the school year also. So he never had $10,000 income from Beijing University. And most of his work was done during his 3 months that he was not working for the university. So he didn't think he had a conflict of interest. Now, maybe he was mistaken, but it was clearly not anything to trick NASA. Okay?
All right, thanks.
You bet.
Thank you. We have a question from Eileen Guo from Tech Review. I don't know if we can unmute her. If not, I could just ask that question. And then let me go ahead and ask that question, which is, and this is probably for both Phil and perhaps for Mike as well. Can you talk about the significance of the FBI agent's acknowledgement of making false statements and accusations, and how that will affect the legal defense strategies moving forward?
Well, you want me to take it first, Mike? There's some things that dawned on me when they asked that question is that before I had an opportunity to cross-examine the FBI agent, they went through a series of questions with him about why his statements in these PowerPoints were not true or inaccurate. And they said, well, his explanation was, well, we were still investigating, and the information we got, was just, I don't want to misquote him, but basically they came up with a lot of excuses. So I think my first question when he got on cross was, you just spent the last 10, 15 minutes trying to give all the excuses why there's so many lies in these PowerPoint presentations. I said, are those really excuses? So I don't know exactly where he came from with this stuff. I don't know if he made them up out of whole cloth or whether somebody told him. We have an initial investigation memo that he drafted and they produced in discovery. And he said that some of his sources were of varying degrees of reliability. Two of the main statements he put in that first document, in the first paragraph of that document, were false, that Anming Hu was a member of the 1,000 Talents program. And I don't remember the other one off the top of my head, but my belief is they use those documents to weaponize the administrators at UT. In other words, to get them thinking, oh my goodness, who is this guy? He's been working for us all along. And we didn't know this, we didn't know that, we didn't know this. The funny thing is, they never even checked the conflict of interest form in relation to giving him a NASA grant. Nobody ever looked at it. And now the federal government says, well, he lied on it, so he should be arrested. They didn't even look at it to know whether they should rely on it or not. So anyway, does that answer your question?
And I'll just add that it's kind of how bias works, which is what Frank talked about, right? That that if you're biased, you tend to view facts that are not objectively suspicious with suspicion because it's bias driving your suspicion. On top of that, if you look at the FBI training materials for counterintelligence, when I was with the ACLU, we obtained some of these documents through the Freedom of Information Act, and there was a presentation on quote unquote the Chinese that purported to describe more than 1 billion people in these very crass stereotypes. And so if agents are being trained to believe that the Chinese government is engaging in a whole of society approach where everyone who comes over with any nexus to that country is a spy, you can understand how agents would jump to conclusions based on evidence that doesn't actually bring them there. And the point in this investigation is, while that might have justified initiating the investigation, it shouldn't have justified the prosecution. And that's where the China initiative, I think, is particularly pernicious, is because it does compel US attorneys' offices as well as FBI agents to produce statistics for the program, rather than having a broad economic espionage program, which of course this case wouldn't fit into, because it wasn't a case of economic espionage. And once they realized it wasn't economic espionage, they could have moved on, because again, I do believe there are real threats out there, and that's where those resources should be focused, rather than chasing after somebody they know isn't the type of person that they're supposed to be looking at.
Great. Thanks, Mike. The next question is from Zhaoyang Feng from BBC.
Hi, hello. Thank you for hosting this presser, and congratulations. I consider this as a success of all your efforts to educate the public and also China-born scientists about what's facing them right now. My question will be, could you provide a little more details about how the FBI investigation and the legal case have affected the life and research of Dr. Hu and also your family, and what will be your future plans other than what we just discussed? Thank you.
That's really a question for Professor Hu, but I think you want me to answer that for you. Is that what I mean? Yes? Okay. Thank you for the question. All the way through this, Anming has been amazing. I thank God that we were able to get him out of jail a couple of weeks after he got arrested, even though they put him in house arrest. I've never had a client with 2 PhDs before, and he was restricted to his house, so he had a great opportunity to work on this case day and night, and he did. And his whole house became a war room, so to speak. We tried to keep the channels of communication open with the University of Tennessee first, trying to hold on to, we asked that he be granted suspension with pay. We got an answer very quickly on that one. And then for a while, they were just keeping him suspended. And then they found out that he could not renew his working visa because he had to go back to the border and re-enter, and the court would not let him leave his house. So they said, well, we have no alternative other than to terminate him. And they've done that. So from the day he got arrested in February of 2020 until now, he's been without any kind of income. His wife is working very hard to support the kids and the children and her job, and 2 houses, one up in Canada and one here in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's started to get great support from the community, though. People have really chipped in and helped. The Chinese Christian church here in town is where I met Anming. My wife is Chinese, and so I think he's had all the way through a pretty good attitude about it. And now he's even got a better attitude. And so I think, he's talking about writing a book. And we'll just have to see what the future holds. Okay.
Thank you. I also wonder whether Mrs. Hu want to say a few words about this ordeal and how you feel right now.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, thanks for your question. You know, I still fight for my innocence, but if the turn out to be true, so I mean, I get my freedom, I will continue fight for my job. I need to take the permanent professor Pershing from the UTK. I mean, back to my, I want to return to my Pershing. And also I want to continue my green card application because they terminated, when I was terminated, they closed that. You know, I worked for US, you know, in the past, almost 6 years, I see. I spend most of my time, even sacrifice the family time and weekend, a holiday for that. So, you know, they damage my career and damage you know, the dream. I mean, it's really, really shock to me. I mean, really changed my life significantly. But all of those, I'm working for that. I contribute to that. I should legally to get that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe the next question from Yiwen Lu from SupChina. Great, thank you.
Hello, thank you for taking this question. So this question is for Michael. First of all, on the FBI agent, when they're doing the investigation without Professor Hu knowing, they used the ground of reasonable suspicion. I'm wondering, how does that ground stand legally, and has that been used in similar cases of investigation before? And I also have another question for Phil that I would probably just ask here. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the legal implications of the immigration side for Professor Hu in future, when, so say for example, when he's trying to leave the US border, what would be the impact on that for this case? Thank you.
Thanks for the question on the FBI's investigative authorities. They're governed by what are called the Attorney General's Guidelines for Domestic FBI Operations. And that establishes 3 types of investigations: what they call an assessment, which requires no factual predicate. Agents can open up assessments on their own initiative based on their own interpretation that what they're doing is authorized. They have an authorized purpose. They're doing it to protect national security. They're doing it to uncover crime. They're doing it to uncover terrorism. The second stage of investigation is called a preliminary investigation. And the predication required for that is simply an allegation. And a 2010 Inspector General report made clear that the FBI agents often make the allegations. So it's an extremely low standard. It's when it's a full investigation that it requires a reasonable indication based on articulable facts. And that is a standard that many law enforcement officers know from Terry stops. From Terry stops, it's the standard that they can stop somebody on the street, that they can pull over your car, that there is reasonable suspicion. So it's fairly well known, but it's not enforced in the breach, right? The FBI management is who controls whether those cases get open. And we've seen time and time again, cases get open when there are, in fact, are not reasonable facts indicating that the activity has taken place. And here's a good example where the facts that justified opening an economic espionage case obviously were not proven to be true, and yet that didn't end the investigation.
One of the things they did early on is they put Anming on a list at the airports that he was going to I think this was before the initial interview, was it not, Anming? He was going to Japan for a seminar, and he went through and they took his name and they took his computer, they took his telephone. They said, "Oh, we're going to go through this." He ended up going to Japan without any of his personal items as far as documents. And they went through the whole thing, didn't find a thing. And when he came back, they just gave it back to him through the local authorities here in Knoxville. But they have a lot of power to do what they want to do.
Thanks, Phil. We received one question about asking a little bit more about sort of who the jury was, and in particular, whether there was a final vote. Obviously, depending on where cases are tried, sometimes you're allowed to submit a jury questionnaire afterwards to get a little bit better understanding of the trial and how they were thinking. I don't know if this was the case here or what else you may have gleaned after the trial about what the jury was thinking.
Yeah, John, the local rule here in the Eastern District of Tennessee is that none of the parties can talk with the jurors unless they petition the court and ask for permission. We don't know exactly what the count was. I imagine the jurors will start talking. Maybe they'll start giving out information. Usually you find out sooner or later some information about the number of people for or against. But as Ming always said, it only took one, right? To see the sense. But I don't know if we're interested in even going that route.
Fair enough. Thank you. And I think we have time for one final question. I believe, let's see, there was a quick follow-up question. Is Professor Hu still under house arrest? Is he now able to fix his immigration status, or how will that look in the future?
Well, he's still under house arrest because the government has not decided whether to drop the charge or issue a notice that they're going to retry it. Although we did ask the magistrate if Professor Hu could come over to my house for Father's Day hamburger cookout, and maybe he might be able to make it after all. So they have granted him permission to go to the doctors every once in a while and to come over Sunday afternoon for a hamburger. As long as he's back by 7 p.m.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I think that is perhaps a great way to end this prep briefing on a very happy note, and to be able to have Professor Hu and Phil yourself celebrate Father's Day together and celebrate at least one step. Certainly for our community, we believe in the right direction towards justice. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this press briefing. If you have additional questions, reach out to the contact information that you received for this press advisory, and we'll make sure to reach out to the appropriate people for whom you might have questions. And please do continue to follow this case to see where this goes. It is obviously important for the public to be informed about cases like this, issues such as the China Initiative, so that we really ensure that sort of justice does reflect who we are as America. Thank you very much.
Thank you.